Hey guys, I'm Ben, and today I'm going to bring you part 2 of my favorite underrated thrash metal bands from the late 80s and early 90s. Now, there are many bands that are deserving of this list, and you could even make the argument that many of the bands that weren't the big four also qualify. Definitely bands like Testament, Exodus, Overkill, Nuclear Assault, Death Angel, Metal Church, and various others who are well known in the thrash and metal world in general, but who never had massive commercial success in the realm of the big four, by definition are perhaps considered underrated. And while I do agree from that point of view, this list of mine is more about my own personal favorites of perhaps the more underground and overlooked and generally more obscure. And in some case, as was in part 1 of this list, there's some of my favorite bands across all genres, but especially in thrash, bands like, Coroner, Realm, and Toxic. So before we continue, if you like what I'm doing here, please hit the subscribe and like buttons. And go over to my channel to check out all the other hard rock, heavy metal, and extreme metal content over there. Plenty of good, fun stuff waiting for you. Anyway, guys, with all that being said, I've got another batch of bands that need some modern day love, so let's get started. The first band I want to talk about are the Bavarian badasses known as Vendetta. So these guys were first active between 1984 and 1990 and then reunited in 2002 and are still active to this day, I believe. Like their contemporaries like Exuma and Paradox, Vendetta brought their own flavor to bear in powerful ways. Firstly, on their debut album 1987's Go and Live, Stay and Die, we get a young band in its raw state, but already exhibiting their abilities as songwriters as well as the sheer speed, aggression, and skill that was already in great form on this album. Achim Hollermain and Michael Weiner, who both handled guitars and lead vocals during the first incarnation of the band, both sound pretty raw vocally here. Kind of in the same way that you've got like a young James Hetfield sounding raw, young and raw on Kill 'Em All. But it all works and they sound absolutely great. The riffs kick ass, and the band plays with passion and the album rips hard. Definitely check it out if you haven't. The next thing the band would release is 1988's dead set killer album called Brain Damage. Here the band would take a huge leap forward, not only with the overall production, but the compositions and performances as well. Klaus Ulrich opens the album on the track War with some sort of almost like funky slap bass thing before the band explodes and it's pure glorious thrash power. Really fantastic, memorable riffs, top tier guitar solos, and interesting song progressions make Brain Damage one of the most engaging albums in thrash. Everything is leveled up from the first album, and everything from the vocal delivery to the drums attack are all refined to perfection, but without losing any of the ferocity. The band also brings in more musical diversity into the compositions and goes off in directional tangents, but it all works beautifully. The album is stacked with great tracks, with plenty of catchy moments. Tracks like War, the opening track, the title track Brain Damage is great. Conversations, Precious Existence is really cool. The crazy bass intro of Fade to Insanity. The whole album slays, really. You can just go through the whole thing. Really, I can't find any fault with it. It's a perfect thrash album. Anyway, if you haven't checked these guys out or haven't revisited them in a while, do yourself a favor and get on that shit immediately. You won't regret it. Next, we have another German band, this time hailing from Berlin, the mightily insane and one of my favorite bands, Mekong Delta. So these guys were active in 1985 until 1997, then reuniting with a new lineup in 2006 until today. Choosing to shroud themselves in mystery in the early days, believing that their German identities wouldn't be accepted internationally, the band members always took on sort of non-German sounding stage names. That, combined with the fact that the music itself was incredibly technical, esoteric, and downright bizarre at times, made them probably a hard sell to the casual punter. However, for those of us who love complex and crazy, then Mekong Delta was just what the doctor ordered. The band, who is basically led by bass player and founder Ralph Hubert, has seen many lineup changes over their long career, and that probably hasn't helped them either. However, with all that internal turmoil, there's my mandatory tongue twister for each video, they still managed to produce some of the most killer and interesting technical and progressive thrash of the 80s. And, you know, they're still making great albums today, albeit with a completely different lineup to their early days, except for Ralph. For our purposes today, I want to talk about their first 4 albums, which are all fantastic. In 1987, they released their self-titled debut, Mekong Delta. And from the first seconds of the opening track, Without Honor, it's clear that you're in for a wild ride with these guys. Immediately both eclectic and intense, and yet loaded with a true onslaught of thrash power. The guitar playing by Frank Frick and Rainer Kelchitz is wild and excellent, and the band at times is reminiscent of Voivod with their use of chords and chaotic structures. It's all held together with the absolute drum fire of Jörg Michael, who just kills here. And fronting this chaotic glory was the wonderfully weird sounding, but awesome, in my opinion, and my favorite of all the singers of Mekong Delta, Wolfgang Borgmann, who sounds absolutely great on this album. Moving from sort of gruff thrash barks to mid-range screams and even sort of random falsetto piercings, which are used to great effect here. Mekong Delta are known for their unusual approach, and even though they will expand that element going forward, even here on the debut, the band flexed their compositional muscle, and it's glorious to listen to. A fantastic debut album, and if you haven't heard it and love the more interesting and unusual end of heavy music in, say, the vein of Voivod, then definitely go check it out. They followed that up with 1988's epic, The Music of Erich Zann, named after the well-known H.P. Lovecraft story, of whom Ralph Hubert is a huge fan. The music here is ramped up in technicality and far more progressive. Also, it was the band's first concept album. Musically, the band really took things to another level of intensity, and I absolutely love this one. I would say that the production is pretty shit and thin and a real downgrade sonically from the first album. However, the tracks are so strong that for me personally, I'm happy to look past the production to the absolutely mind-bending songwriting and playing. Here, the band once again incorporates classical themes into their metal, and yet they sort of retain the weirdness and uniqueness that made the debut so damn cool. Another masterpiece of insanity from these guys that I highly, highly recommend to anyone without a weak constitution anyway. This album is not for the faint of heart, and it is only for those who have metal weirdness flowing through their veins. Next, we have 1989's The Principle of Doubt. Having lost Rayner on the second guitar and bringing in new Boltrush, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name properly, so if I'm getting that wrong, I'm really sorry. But anyway, he's great. So he's the replacement. And so the band set about creating an even more refined version of their classical music inspired chaos. And that's just what we get with this album. And just to clarify, it's not, when I say classical, it's not like neoclassical in the way that Malmsteen does it, but more so in a structural sense at times. I mean, there are like moments where it's like you hear them sort of calling onto familiar classical tropes or tunes, but it's more sort of how they put things together than sort of the Malmsteen style neoclassical shred. Anyway, the production here is far better. Everything's sounding much bigger and fuller, and the album actually has some bottom end, which is a nice addition. Again, the album is kind of a concept album. It's like loosely based on Stephen R. Donaldson's dark fantasy trilogy, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. Like Voivod, Mekong Delta really weren't afraid to shake free from the thrash mold whenever it suited them. And that is once again self-evident throughout this great, great album. Another absolutely killer album. So go check that one out too. I love it almost as much as the first two. Probably just as much, actually. I love it. So after another personnel change with both Frank leaving the guitar attack and Wolfgang unfortunately leaving the vocals, the band would bring in American Doug Lee for the next album, 1990s, Dances of Death and Other Walking Shadows. And they wouldn't replace Frank on the guitar, just keeping you doing all the guitars. Here, the band gave us a near 20-minute metal suite, once again with the classical music format in the title track, and it absolutely slays. Fantastic stuff. However, the sound had definitely changed quite dramatically in comparison to the first couple of albums. Just based probably on the different players involved, I would say. The approach, though, is largely the same. You got technicality, intense performances, and chaotic elements, which are still really the bread and butter for Mekong Delta. And this album is no different. This was actually my introduction to the band, and I absolutely love it. Doug and you did a fantastic job of carrying the spirit and the sound of the band forward on this one. These days, I think my favorites are those first three, but all four of these albums are essential Mekong Delta. If you like it wild and chaotic, yet also totally controlled in the hands of great musicians, then definitely check these guys out if you haven't already. And actually, all their albums are pretty great, so you really can't go wrong with their whole catalogue. So next we have the mighty Canadians, known as Sacrifice. Now, I'm fully aware that Sacrifice are quite well known, especially in Canada, and are often considered part of the Canadian Big Four with Razor, Annihilator, and Voivod. So perhaps for some and in some markets, they're not underrated, which is great, but for a band as killer as Sacrifice, I feel they deserve even more love and attention, so they belong on this list for that reason. So they were active originally from 1983 until 1993 and then reformed in 2006 until the present day. In that time, they gave us a 5-album catalog, which is near perfect. But today I want to talk about my 3 favorite albums from these guys. So in 1987, the band would release their mighty sophomore album, Forward to Termination. As much as I like their debut Torment in Fire, which is great, for me, the band seemed to really level up in a big way on Forward to Termination. The production is better and the band is playing their asses off here. Every song on this album is a potent mix of sheer nasty aggression and technical proficiency of the playing. The guitars handled by Rob Urbanati and Joe Rico are as heavy as those concrete shoes the Mafia witness is wearing at the bottom of the river. And the shredding is top tier stuff. Rob is handling the vocals on this album, and his screams and barks and shrieks are just mean and nasty and gross, and I absolutely love every second of it. Also, you've got Scott Watts and Gus Pine doing a great job at locking down the full frontal rhythm section assault. A phenomenal thrash classic that kills from the first riffs of the title track to the last dying scream from Rob at the end. This is often my favorite from the band, but so is the next one. 1990s Soldiers of Misfortune. So here, the band didn't make any huge changes to their sound, but simply further refined and expanded and strengthened it. The songs on this album just feel like 10% more memorable for me, and I probably go to this album the most. I don't know, yeah, maybe. But like I said, it's very close anyway. Again, the guys are in absolutely top form here, giving us an unrelenting thrash attack with great playing and ferocity that is a real trademark of this great band. The only thing about this album that is maybe a little bit underwhelming is the production feels a bit flat in comparison to their other albums. However, it's a very minor gripe for me because this album is thrash perfection with zero weak spots, in my opinion, musically that is. The band's ability to balance their technical abilities and songwriting with the fierce attack is very impressive, and I love how uplifting and savage it can sound at the same time. Really awesome stuff. Definitely go check out this album if you haven't, and revisit it if you have. Next, the band would temporarily replace Gus with Michael Rosenthal on the drums, and with this lineup, they would release 1993's really underrated gem, in my opinion, Apocalypse Inside. So here, again, the band delivers an album stacked with killer riffing, blazing solos, and savage vocals. But this time, some of the groove elements of the 90s metal scene are sprinkled in at various points across the album. It's still quintessentially thrash, but it does feel a bit more contemporary to the time period. Similar to the way Coroner's album, Grin, did around the same time, while retaining their signature sound and everything that makes them great, while also incorporating some new elements. Sparingly, but there definitely is a bit of a slight shift there. The song Flesh is a good example with its groove metal opening riff that actually reminds me a little bit of the Soundgarden song Gun. It's kind of a similar riff, but it's a cool one anyway. As always, it's all executed like the total pros these guys are, and it sounds absolutely kick-ass. I really love this album. Maybe not quite as much as the other two, but I still unreservedly recommend it. So for anyone who doesn't know Sacrifice, definitely do yourself a favor and go dive headfirst into their albums. Great band. Next, we have another German band, this time hailing from Dusseldorf, called Death Row. So, I don't know too much about these guys, except for the fact that they formed in 1984 as Samhain, but changed their name to Death Row by the time they got to their first album, 1986's Satan's Gift, which was later renamed Riders of Doom when it was re-released on Noise Records. It was originally on Combat Records. So this was followed up in 1987 by Raging Steel. Both cool albums, but it's the next two that I particularly gravitate to. In 1989, the band would drop its definitive statement with their third album called Deception Ignored. Here, the band would show what they were really capable of. Unlike their previous two albums, which were more straight-ahead thrash, here on this album, the band unleashed their technical and progressive thrash abilities into the songwriting, and it's awesome stuff. The fast-paced thrash attack is present and correct, and the album is absolutely loaded with fantastic guitar shredding and riffing. The vocals are also pretty great, with a more sort of sung approach, but still with plenty of hard edge to it. And you've also got the requisite gang vocals as well. The band have a few longer epics here showing their progressive tendencies in tracks like Triocton, Narcotic, and Machinery. And the playing is precise and technical while retaining a great feel throughout. Definitely one of the truly standout technical thrash metal albums of this era, and any fan of that end of the thrash metal spectrum will find a lot to love with this fantastic album. Next, the band would release their final album in 1992 called Life Beyond. Here, the band took what they'd done with Deception Ignored and further refined it, not necessarily making it better, but just perhaps sounding more confident in this approach. This album seems to get forgotten, at least, it seems to me anyway, whenever this band's discussed. But for my money, I think it's another fantastic, hard-hitting, progressive, technical thrash album. Some of these, later thrash metal bands that I discussed in the part one video that I made, and these ones here were definitely, I would say, victims of the 90s musical shift. Thrash just wasn't popular in the early 90s, and that period of the late 80s and early 90s is when thrash bands really began to make it much more interesting for me, because many of these were becoming more technical and progressive, yet retain that drive and aggression without going all the way into death metal. Anyway, sadly, Life Beyond would be Death Row's last album, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's technical, it's progressive, it's aggressive, and it's awesome. So definitely go check it out. Anyway, guys, I'll leave the list there for now. I'll probably make this a series with at least a part 3, because there are many great underrated or obscure thrash bands that need more love. I know some people get a bit hung up on that word underrated, but whatever, I really don't give a fuck. I just want to give some love and attention to some of these great bands that I love and spread the word. Anyway, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Stay metal, and see you next time.